Hello everyone, my name is Renate. I'm speaking to you about implementing a scalable digitization process. I know it's late in the afternoon on the second day, but I'm very grateful for you to join my talk. I will talk a little bit about myself first so that you know who is talking to you today. My name is Renate Eder. I started as a 3D material developer way back in 2003 to develop 3D digital twins basically of real life materials at 3DX site here in Munich. Then I joined Adidas as a material creation technologies manager to implement 3D apparel processes throughout the supply chain, meaning training suppliers in 3D technology, choosing the right tools, working with IT how to transfer the tools, with marketing how they should be approved, and sales how to work with 3D samples in order to save salesman samples and prototypes. And that brought me a bit more, into the fashion and sportswear business, I must say, because beforehand I had not a big clue what's going on in the textile industry. In 2017, I joined Visu, a material digitization company, and I'm now also gladly the managing partner and CCO of the company. Yeah. So then, talking about scaling digital materials, what we would start with today is to explain a little bit what a digital material is, that we are all kind of on the same page what we are talking about, and then we would carry on to see how material digitization can be implemented and how it could be scaled. And I will also follow up by some nice examples we have from the audience here, from the brands and the suppliers. So what is a digital material? So we think of a digital material in two aspects when we talk about digitization the material aspects. So first, there are the visual properties of a material, meaning how the material looks. So if we talk about the 3D visualization of a material, the program requires image-based description of the several individual visual properties. That's something I would go into a little bit more detail in the next slide. So we have this look of a material, and the second aspect would be what we call the physical properties or physical parameters. It is how a material behaves. So if I drape a material over a body, I will definitely see the reflectance, color, transparency changing. But of course, I see also a bend and a stretch and some weight interacting with the gravity basically happening in a fabric. So that's the second aspect we are talking about when digitizing a material. Basically those behavioral aspects which are needed for fabric simulation engines, like many of you know, tools like Browseware or Clo3D, those type of programs who need to ingest this data in order to do a 3D 3D simulation of a fabric. So what is that in more detail? So assuming we have some shape, could be a jacket, a pant, or whatever 3D shape you envision. And on this base shape, we would now apply the visual properties of a material, starting with the surface structure. So here, we're talking about this image-based description of a surface structure, and then this would change basically the look of the geometry in your 3D program. So we basically we're doing a composition of the single aspects of material in this 3D space. So a second image would be the color image. So we would add the color on top in our 3D environment to have now the color and structure impression. The next would be reflectivity. So how does light interact with the surface structure? So that's, in this case, a more metal aspect on these little dots, giving us this impression of metalness in the 3D world. And the same, and I'm just switching to another material which makes it a little bit more obvious, the same would be for transparency. So also that's a separate image layer which needs to be there in your 3D tool in order to describe a material. And that's what you will also see in a 3D tool, which is required for your visual aspects. From a physical standpoint, so these physical material properties, that's not the extensive list, but basically we can consider the bend, the stretch, the thickness and weight of a fabric which is needed to describe the behavior of a fabric in a 3D simulation tool. And only if those aspects are considered and captured and accurately captured, then we can talk about a digital twin of a fabric. So you would, at the end, after your digitization process, compare that to a photograph, for example, a simulation, and then say, okay, are my visual aspects and my behavioral aspects the same? Then you could say, okay, that's the digital twin I've created. So this is, when I'm talking about material digitization, that's kind of what should happen in the background. Yeah. So there are different technologies and tools to do that, but just that we know what the digital fabric or the digital material is from this standpoint. Yeah. So now we would like to implement, or we would like to kick off a material creation project. Could be for any type of purpose. So as a brand looking into 3D design, as a supplier maybe populating your website or meeting your brand's requirements in terms of digitalization, could be like a lot of different use cases. So we together would now take some first steps together in this process. So what do we do? Yeah, so that's many clients or many prospects ask us, so I want to do this material digitalization, so what should I do now? Yeah. So I tried to highlight a little bit when you think about a proof of concept phase to say, okay, I want to look into this topic, and that's now true for material digitalization, but at the end it's also true for any type of other 3D project. If you look into 3D design, would be the same, very similar process. Yeah? So from my standpoint, it would be to define a certain business case, evaluate the technology, and then test your hypothesis at the end. Yeah. So what do we do, or what would be our business case? Like first from a theoretical standpoint, and then I will show you some example. So the first topic for me, and what I always tell clients, is that it's really essential to define your tiny business case for your proof of concept, meaning that what is your number one pain point you want to solve with material digitization or with 3D in general. There has to be some pain. Yeah, is it color variations? Is it inconsistency in the visual output? Is it placement of graphics on your t-shirts? There has to be some issue you want to solve, and you would concentrate on just one single thing. Yeah. Then, of course, collecting some ideas how you could solve that and how 3D especially could solve that, and try to follow this path. I would also always advocate for a very limited scope to test, so that you're not overwhelmed with the amount of data, but rather try to figure out a kind of amount or some scope which is needed for this test or for this first proof of concept, and not just go for a mass in the very first step. Yeah. When we talk about business case, come back to that a little bit, don't expect the ROI come in your first proof of concept. Let's keep that for the scaling part. Yeah. Then for the technology part, first evaluate, of course, which technology is out there on the market. I think that's something anyway which is a very obvious part. And then when doing this evaluation, or when you figure out certain technologies, and there will be plenty and you might get overwhelmed in choosing the right tool, try to figure out what is the number one priority for your tool to implement, or for this evaluation project. Even think for this proof of concept first. Yeah. So what is your priority to have a successful proof of concept? Is it a very simple tool, or you you don't want to spend a lot of money, or does it have to be very easy to learn, or do you want to be done very quickly with this proof of concept, or do you have maybe someone with some knowledge internally, and maybe you just use the tool this lady or gentleman knows. Yeah, so any of those is okay. Yeah, so you just want to prove that your idea works. Yeah, and then you define, of course, your initial budget you wanna spend on this test. Yeah. You should find the right tool, but again, I would say find the right tool for your proof of concept, and be open to maybe re-evaluate the technology later, and not get stuck in the tool decision. That's very often the case, that you try to find the perfect tool which works for your proof of concept, for your baby steps, for your scale process, and in 3 and 10 years it should still work, and then it might get very hard to get it going, because you might not be able to decide. Yeah. And then, of course, we have to test. So you execute your proof of concept, and then you figure out if your idea has worked. And it's very, very important to collect feedback after this proof of concept before moving further. And now I run through a little example with you, so it's not too theoretical what I'm talking about. So I've just pulled out some example, which is a very common one, I would say, when you talk to fabric supplier, so a fabric vendor, for example. So what would be, why would I go into material digitization? One example could be, oh, I have such an inconsistent look on my website and I want to get that more consistent. Of course, could be any other example, like having too many color iterations, to other things, but we would concentrate on this one topic now. So I have this very inconsistent look on my website, and I want to solve that. Yeah, and I think I can solve that by replacing those photo shoots with digital material renderings. That's my assumption, and I would limit the scope. So let's use it only for, maybe I have a lot of different fabrics, and I would only use it for twill. Could be also just my new season's fabric, or some other little scope, because we also see that when we talk to people interested in going down this digitization path, one of the first things is, but I have 3,000 fabrics and then that takes too long and I don't know how to start. Yes, but why not trying it out for a limited scope and first figure out if it even works for your case. Yeah, so we are choosing our twills now for this example, and then it comes to the technology. So now we are finding the right tool. So now you can ask consultants, you can visit fairs like this one, or other technology fairs or other fabric fairs, or browse the internet for examples out there. And then for our case, we say, okay, we limit our budget to 2,000 euros now of investment for this proof of concept, for the tool of the proof of concept. And then we find that we could use a flatbed scanner, we could use our XTech software, for example. You could use other tiling and 3D texturing tools like Crazy Bump is something mentioned here. Then Adobe Substance is a very common tool to be used. Or you maybe just engage someone for a scanning service and say, okay, what can I do for 2,000 euros? So now we test this. We have spent, or we're spending this money, we execute, and we get our fabrics digitized. So we did that. Assuming that went pretty fast, right? So we focused on speed today. And now, let's say we have done our renderings, our twill renderings on our website. And now we ask people for feedback. I would ask internal people and external people for feedback, like very open feedback, and really try to nail down the issues. Because we also saw in some implementation projects, especially when it's bigger projects around 3D design, then there are some issues, and the feedback is, 3D doesn't work. But you really need to know what does not work in 3D. Yeah, so is it maybe the folds which don't look realistic? Maybe it's not shiny enough. Is it really 3D? Like, why would 3D not work? Yeah, it's surely something about the image, or about the execution, or about the process. So you have to be very very precise or really nail it down to what is really the issue, what should not work, and then figure out how this can be solved. And it's a lot, most of the time, it's a lot about communication actually, and not really about any technology issue. That's what we figured out also, or what I also figured out in my past career steps actually. And then, of course, it could be that it fails, so just stop it, or you continue, and then you have to figure out how it can be continued. So you need to think about scaling it. So how do I get this from this little scope, maybe my 50 twill fabrics, to something bigger? Yeah. So for our example here, for refining, we would now refine a little bit the business case and run through the 3 steps I've explained earlier. So we try to figure out what we could, so how could we extend the scope? So we could say we did our twills, now we do the jerseys. But in our case, I thought let's not do only the twills, but enhance maybe our 3D, like our experience or website user experience by having, let's say, a pen next to our twill image. Yeah, so that would be also a way to scale or to make something bigger or figure out a new use case. So it's not always just of replacing something. 3D could also add some value, add something which we have not had up front. Then, of course, identify the issues up front you think which could happen when scaling, and try to already find some answer to it, that you're not like trying to grow it and someone comes around the corner and tries to stop it because there's something you have not thought about. So here, again, the communication is maybe the bigger topic than the technology itself. Yeah? And then, of course, there could be now the first thought at how quickly or what could be generated, or how could an ROI be generated. So can I already save photo shootings, or is there something which is maybe less monetary, but I'm increasing the client, or like improving the client communication. Maybe they can decide faster which twill they want to choose this year, or other kind of benefits which can be derived from that. Yeah. And one thing I mentioned earlier is that in this step, it might be also needed to change the technology or revise what you have used so far to make it scalable. So maybe you now need something faster or easier to use, or other type, or maybe better quality output than you had in your proof of concept. And then, but as you have already proved that it works, you will also generate some ROI, and then the investment can also be revised, basically. You can also think not only about the technology itself, but whom you're partnering up with, because in the terms of this technology implementation, or no matter if it's 3D or other stuff, it's also good to build a strong or a good long-term relationship with your the vendor of your tools, yeah, no matter if it's software or hardware. So now we are growing that a little bit bigger, and eventually you will have to think about 3 big topics at the end, which I will not dive into because the time will be too short today. But at the end, you have to figure out those steps in your process, like how will I generate my digital materials, like how do I do these digitization steps? Also, actually, which is not necessarily mentioned here, but who will do it? Will I do it? Will my will the brand will do it? Will the vendor do it? Will an agency do it? It's like who is doing this material digitization? It has to be done somewhere. And then how do I get the data? So how are they stored, shared, and organized? And then where and how do I generate this value from the 3D file? Because this is the step where the ROI is generated, right? So the first things are basically the doing. But at the end, the third part is your business case, which has to be stronger the more you scale, of course. So I've collected some examples from some of our clients so that you have some ideas how materials are used today, and how a successful implementation can look like, and where digital materials or 3D in general is used. It's not only digital materials, because of course we are part of this 3D value chain, so it's always nice to see some nice stories or some success stories. the easiest one is the sample reduction at Adidas. I know very well because I was part of that many years ago. So prototypes and salesman samples were saved there in a pretty large scale by asking the vendor to create prototypes and salesman samples in a digital form instead of a physical form. Then another sportswear example where 3D design is used extensively now. Here an example from Under Armour, but there are many other brands digging into the 3D design topic at the moment. And also a nice site when you look at the customization slide of sites of Salomon, for example, where the footwear, like a super nice footwear configuration, which looks pretty true to life. Yeah. Some examples more from the supplier standpoint. So our friends here from GML have their 3D library online. So when you're interested in having your trims and elastics for your 3D design, that's live. They have their own digital library to be browsed. We generated in collaboration with another agency very nice lookbooks here. And we just had another chat with another company today. How can we get rid of those heavy lookbooks where we have all those little swatches inside and the shipment is so expensive? Can there be a PDF or some other form of online tool to replace those pretty static way of looking at the fabrics? And of course here at the fabric fair, I think everyone should have seen the 3D ready logos here in the forum. So why, when I'm touching and feeling experience a fabric, why can I not take the data away to use it tomorrow in my 3D design? That's something we have asked ourselves many years, and now it's kind of solved to say, hey, if I now experience a nice fabric in the forum and I know how to use 3D tools, then I just grab the data and use it tomorrow in my design. So that's just some highlights and a very condensed form of what we are doing and what 3D can be used. I did not keep you very long today because I know it's it's late in the afternoon, and I think I just want to create some or give some inspiration. What can be done or what different aspects can be touched using 3D technology. And if you want to know more, this is us. We are here down there in the booth, or of course anytime online, please reach out and then we have a chat about it.
When she says here down there in the booth, she means right in the corner, far wall. You'll recognize them. They're a good friendly bunch. They've been working with us for some time. But can we first offer you our appreciation for the work that you've just presented? So we're happy to take questions. There are no virtual questions, so I'm looking at the audience. Because if I don't get questions from the audience, I ask her really awkward ones. So she's hoping that you guys will come up with questions. Because I'm going to dive in. Sorry about this. Visualization, great. How close are you on haptic technology as well? So the touch and the feel, that's the next magic hurdle that we need to do. You're communicating great information. We now have color match. How far away do you think haptic is?
From a timing perspective,
I told you they were hard. I don't expect a really easy answer either.
I think from a timing perspective, I cannot say, but I think also a few years ago we have solved the visual part of materials, not saying VV, but in general it was pretty much standardized and solved how to do the visual or describe the visual appearance of a fabric. Now it's pretty much clear how the behavior of the drape of a behavior is should be described, and there's already research going on, and there is already technology, and there is also hardware, and there are also quantifiable models to describe haptics. So there is research and even products around that. It's not there at a large scale, but I think it will follow just a similar way, like when, I don't know, in 2008 or so, when we rolled out the 3D in Adidas, then maybe today not everyone is doing the rollout yet. It might be the same process, right? That the first guys are looking into the haptic topics now, and maybe in a few years maybe 5. I don't know.
I mean,
It will be there.
here in academia, we're expecting by the end of this decade, there will be a decent commercial system. And this time in 10 years' time, we will actually go, what was the problem? Because that's what's happened with,
as I said, there is
colour
pretty
match.
good. There are pretty good ideas around that already to quantify how to quantify this touch and feel. And at the end, you always have to figure out what are you doing with it. Like it only has to be good enough to solve your business case, right? The same. If you have a 3D example, if I'm just wanted to check the placement of my graphic, I don't care if my pattern is 100%, if it's like 1 or 2 millimeter off, or if the drape is exactly correct of my fabric. If I'm just talking about fabric placement, so I just want to decide on my fabric placement. And same for haptics. What do I want to do? Do I just quantify the haptics of one fabric and find similar? Or is it something I want to dive into an AR, VR environment and completely touch and feel and experience also the fabric from an emotional standpoint? These are two very, very different things. Talking about haptics, one which is kind of actually already like at least from a research perspective solved, and the other one is something we don't know yet really how to do it. Yeah, so it also has to be very dependent on
I'm
what
also
you want to
aware
solve. Yeah.
this is very much a turkey voting for Christmas, because when we go virtual on haptic, we don't need to turn up to a fair. And I like coming to Germany, it gets me out of Britain.
Figured
I'm
it out.
still seeing no more questions from the audience. Can I ask you once again to show your appreciation?